Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually just stepped off a plane from Fiji, so I'm in the bizarre situation of finding Fiji is already here in Bonn. And I actually wear my Fijian flower, which is the way people, male, female, of all ages, all have this behind their ear looking very elegant, but I'm just wearing it here for now. I don't feel too elegant today. Right, so I'm going to talk to you about Genebanks and their role in climate change. And as Margaret was telling us, agriculture must transform over the next 30 years in order for us to avoid mass famine, basically. 60% increased production is needed to keep up with the increase in world population figures. If that production is to happen, there must also be an adaptation of our crops to the abiotic stresses that they're experiencing and the increasing incidence and spread of pests and diseases, amongst other things. And as well as all of that, agriculture has a responsibility to reduce the emissions that they're producing. Current levels of 19% estimated or more of total greenhouse gases coming from agriculture must come down. To make this transformation happen, plant genetic resources very much underpin the possibilities that there are for changing agriculture, and they affect every aspect of agricultural systems, from the state of soil and the management of water to the state of ecosystems, the ability to deal with pests and diseases and their resilience and to increase yield. So plant genetic resources are behind them all, whether at a system level, whether we're talking about diverse agricultural systems or whether we're talking about diverse species within those systems, or whether we're talking about diversity within the species, so diversity of varieties. All of these layers of diversity of plant genetic resources are very important to our future existence. And coming back from Fiji, one of the crops we were talking about there and is very important to those populations existing over a vast geographical area there in the Pacific is a crop like coconut. Very important to them, very resilient in the face of cyclones and climate change and rising sea levels, producing an important level of protection to the coastlines and to the ecosystems, and bringing income to very poor, marginalized smallholder farmers. So here is a key crop where that plays a role, a very important role in the future of our agriculture. And perhaps more familiar is the story of breeding and how we're able to build new, improved varieties that have traits that can deal with climate change. This is a key source of hope for the future. And one of the important sources of those traits come from crop wild relatives. In fact, a great deal of work has already been done to integrate the traits that we find in the wild species that are related to crops, conveying a large number of different and important traits to improve varieties, particularly where wild relatives in centres of diversity have had a long experience of battling well-known pests and pathogens within those centres of diversity and can now convey those traits into improved varieties. And this is where we come to Genebanks, because it is in Genebanks that we are able to conserve and research and develop better understanding of these plant genetic resources. And right now, as I'm standing here now, I can say we don't really know the full value of what we are conserving in those Genebanks. But equally, we don't know the extent of the challenges we will face. What we do know is that Genebanks provide us options, many options for how we move forward. And equally as important as the actual facilities, the physical seeds in the Genebanks, is the system within which we're working. No one country is self-sufficient in genetic resources. It depends completely on a layer of collaboration across continents and across countries. And this exists in the International Plant Treaty. We will hear more from Thomas Meyer about that. In a multilateral system of access and benefit sharing. It exists in international gene banks that are able to reach very high standards of operation and ensure that materials are held in the long term. It also exists equally in the same centres being able to put in place very high levels of phytosanitary controls so that we do not spread pests and diseases. And equally in the information systems that are shared across countries so that we know what are in these gene banks. So we're very much dependent on there being a global system of collaboration and coordination here. And what I want to tell you specifically about is the Genebank platform that is developed within the CGIAR in the 11 centres that have a responsibility to manage these resources for the international community. And these are located in various developing countries, mostly in the centres of crop diversity of the crops that they care and manage for. And in this Genebank platform, we are targeting target 2.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly with an aim to maintain the genetic diversity and increase the levels of genetic diversity of seeds and cultivated plants held in those gene banks, and importantly, promoting their use and promoting access and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from those genetic resources. And a core part of our work is very, well, you could almost call it routine. It's very much putting in place the kinds of operations that will ensure that none of these seeds lose viability or are lost from the collections. Many of them date back many decades, collected from farmers' fields back in the 60s and the 70s. And these are, in many cases, these gene banks that are the only places you can still find these seeds. So there is a large amount of work involved in ensuring that they are safe and healthy and free of pests and diseases and available for distribution. And indeed, the CG centres are busily providing genetic resources upon request, dealing with more than 2,000 requests every year, distributing more than 100,000 samples annually to more than 100 countries worldwide. And their numbers of accessions in these gene banks, as you see here, around 750,000 accessions, mostly in the form of seed, but also in the form of tissue culture for certain roots and tubers and bananas that do not have seeds that are held viably in storage, and a large collection of plants and trees that are held in the field. These collections are becoming more and more used and more relevant. They have increased distribution levels by something like twofold over the last decade. And we can expect that increase to continue as we get to know the genes and their expression and the traits that they convey within these materials. And there is a vastly improved capability to use these traits and integrate them into improved varieties. And I have to emphasize also, this is a picture from Lebanon, from the Akada Gene Bank. And as Margaret was saying, they have managed to do a tremendous job of gathering not only the materials from the region and looking after them, but in the face of the disaster that they faced in Syria, they were able to rescue their collection. It was all conserved in the Svalbard seed vault, and they have returned to Lebanon and Morocco and replanted out their collections and put them back in storage. So there is a level of security within this global system that is really almost infallible. And I think, as Margaret was saying, they managed to plant these seeds out in difficult conditions where there had been less rain, very much less rain than normal, and still these seeds are viable, and this is very much our genetic heritage from a long time ago, being in very safe hands in ICARDA. Similarly, we have a situation here in SIP where the communities around and about had actually discovered that they'd lost quite a number of their potato varieties that they remembered vaguely from childhood. And the gene bank there, the CGIR Gene Bank, the International Potato Center based in Lima, were able to dig into their collection and find those varieties and repatriate them to the communities. So we have very real examples of how these gene banks show their security, show their availability of resources, and are acting very much in the way and means that we hope to see them carry on. Thank you very much.